"You were the one mistake I wish I could undo," my mom said, smiling like she had just made a harmless joke, her wine glass raised under the soft glow of Christmas lights, and for a second, nobody moved, not even me, because the way she said it wasn't loud or angry, it was calm, almost practiced, like something she had been waiting to say in front of the right audience. The table was full, my dad at the head, carving turkey like nothing had happened, my sister Emily sitting across from me in a fitted red dress, already smirking before the words had fully landed, a couple of aunts and cousins pretending to focus on their plates but clearly listening, and I remember thinking how strange it was that humiliation could feel so quiet, like the room had been padded just enough to soften the impact while still making sure everyone heard it. "Mom," Emily added, laughing under her breath, "that's a little harsh, but I mean, you're not wrong," and that was all it took for a few of them to chuckle, the kind of small, polite laughs people give when they don't want to be the target next, and I felt something tighten in my chest, not explosive, not dramatic, just controlled, like a door slowly locking from the inside. I didn't say anything, not because I didn't have something to say, but because I already knew how this would go if I reacted, because in this family, the moment you defend yourself, you become the problem, and my dad proved it right on cue when he finally looked up and said, "Let's not turn this into a scene, it's Christmas," like I was the one who had just said it, like I was the disruption, not the comment that had just been placed on the table between the mashed potatoes and the cranberry sauce. My mom leaned back in her chair, completely at ease, like she had just corrected a minor detail, and added, "I'm just being honest, Richard, she's always been difficult," and she glanced at me, not with anger, but with something colder, something more final, like she had already decided who I was years ago and this was just her reminding everyone else. Emily took a sip of her drink and looked straight at me, her voice soft but sharp. "I mean, look at where we both are, it kind of speaks for itself," and I could feel the weight of that comparison, the years of it, the way every success of hers had always been used as proof of my failure, even when nobody ever asked what I had been carrying quietly the whole time. One of my cousins shifted uncomfortably, another one stared down at their phone, but nobody said stop, nobody said that wasn't okay, because this was normal here. This was how things worked, you either played your role or you got labeled difficult, ungrateful, dramatic. I picked up my glass, mostly just to have something to do with my hands, and for a moment, I thought about responding, about saying something that would cut just as clean, something that would make them all freeze the way they always did when truth showed up uninvited, but I didn't, not yet, because there was something almost useful about this moment, something about hearing it out loud, in front of everyone, that made everything clearer than it had ever been before. "Say something," Emily nudged, tilting her head slightly, like she was inviting a reaction she could twist, and I just looked at her, then at my mom, then at the rest of the table, and I realized they were all waiting, not to understand me, but to confirm what they already believed. So I set my glass down carefully and said, very evenly, "I'm listening," and that seemed to disappoint them more than anything else, because silence doesn't give them anything to hold against you. Silence doesn't escalate, it just sits there and makes everything they said echo a little louder. My mom exhaled like she had expected more, like she wanted the fight, and said, "Good, maybe you'll finally hear it," and my dad went back to carving, the conversation slowly trying to recover around us, someone asking about travel plans, someone else passing the bread, but the air had already shifted, and I could feel it settling in my chest, not as pain exactly, but as something colder, something more precise, like a decision forming without needing to be spoken, because while they were still seeing this as just another family moment, another dinner where I would sit there and take it, I already knew something they didn't, something that made every word they said feel smaller than they thought it was, and I let the silence stretch just a little longer, because they didn't realize it yet, but this was the last time they would ever get to talk to me like that. The rest of that night moved like nothing had happened, which somehow made it worse, because my mom kept hosting, smiling at everyone, refilling glasses, asking my aunt about her flight and my cousin about his new job, like the sentence she had just said was already behind her, like it had not landed at all, and every now and then she would glance at me, not to check on me, but to measure whether I was still sitting there quietly, still playing my role, while my dad carved another slice of turkey and said things like "pass the gravy" and "make sure everyone gets some," his voice steady, controlled, the kind of tone that keeps everything looking normal from the outside, Emily leaned back in her chair, completely comfortable, scrolling through her phone between bites, occasionally chiming into conversations that had nothing to do with her, always finding a way to circle it back to herself, her promotion, her apartment, her plans for the new year, and each time she spoke, my mom's face softened in a way I had not seen directed at me in years, like pride came naturally when it was about her and had to be forced when it came to me. At one point, my aunt looked at me and asked, "So what have you been up to lately?" And for a second, it felt like an opening, like maybe there was space for me to exist in the conversation, but before I could even answer, my mom cut in lightly, "She is still figuring things out," and smiled in a way that sounded supportive but felt like a label being stamped in place. And my aunt nodded politely, already moving on, because that was enough. That was the version of me that got passed around, simplified, reduced, easy to understand. I felt the words I could have said sit in my chest and then settle, because explaining myself here had never changed anything, it only gave them more material to reshape later. And I had learned that lesson slowly over years of conversations that always ended with me being told I was too sensitive, too reactive, too much. Dinner eventually shifted into dessert, plates were cleared, pie was served, and the room filled with the kind of light laughter that only exists when people decide to ignore what is uncomfortable, and I watched it all from the same seat, noticing small things I used to miss, like how my dad leaned toward Emily when she spoke but never toward me, how my mom corrected the way I held my fork but never the way Emily spoke to me, how nobody ever asked follow-up questions when it came to my life, as if curiosity had already been decided unnecessary. When the night finally started winding down, coats came out, hugs were exchanged, and my mom stood by the door thanking everyone for coming, her voice warm, practiced, the perfect host, and when it was my turn to leave, she hugged me briefly, one arm, quick, efficient, and said, "Drive safe," like that was the only thing left to say, no acknowledgement, no correction. Nothing that suggested she remembered what she had said earlier. And I nodded once, because I was done expecting anything different. Outside, the air was cold enough to sting, the kind of December night where your breath turns visible the second you step out, and I walked to my car without rushing, the gravel crunching under my shoes, the noise louder than it should have been in the quiet, and for the first time that night, I let myself feel it fully, not the sharp kind of hurt that demands a reaction, but something heavier. Something more settled, like the final piece of a pattern clicking into place. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine, my hands resting on the steering wheel, replaying the exact tone of her voice, the way she had smiled when she said it, the way nobody had stopped her, and instead of asking why, I found myself asking something else entirely, something that felt more useful, more grounded in reality. What changes now that I have heard it out loud? My phone buzzed in the passenger seat, a notification lighting up the screen, and I glanced at it without picking it up, already knowing it was not from anyone in that house, because they never reached out first unless they needed something, and that thought stayed with me longer than anything else, not as bitterness, but as information, clear and undeniable. I started the car, the engine turning over smoothly, and pulled out of the driveway, the house getting smaller in the rearview mirror. Lights still glowing warmly from the windows, looking exactly like the kind of place people would describe as a close family from the outside, and I realized that for years I had been trying to earn something that was never actually being offered, and the moment I stopped needing it, everything about the situation shifted, quietly, without anyone else noticing yet. As I drove down the empty road, the radio low, the darkness stretching out ahead, I did not make any dramatic decisions. I did not promise myself revenge or closure or anything that sounded cinematic. I just let one simple conclusion settle in. Steady and irreversible, they had already decided who I was to them, and now it was my turn to decide who they were going to be to me, and I knew, with a clarity I had never had before, that whatever came next would not look anything like the role they expected me to keep playing. The next morning did not come with some dramatic clarity or sudden urge to confront anyone. It came quietly, the way most real changes do, with a sense that something had already shifted and there was no reason to rush it, and I followed my usual routine almost exactly, waking up at the same time, making coffee the same way, checking my emails before getting dressed, but there was a difference in how I moved through it, like I was no longer performing for an invisible audience that expected me to prove something. My phone buzzed once on the counter while the coffee brewed, my mom's name lighting up the screen. and for a second I just looked at it without picking it up, not out of hesitation, but out of curiosity, because she rarely called the morning after anything unless she needed to reframe it, and when I finally answered, her tone was light, almost casual. "I hope you did not take what I said too seriously last night," she said, like it had been a comment about the weather. Something forgettable, and I leaned against the counter, listening carefully. "You know how things get during the holidays, everyone is emotional," she added, and I realized she was not apologizing, she was editing the moment, softening it into something manageable, something that would not require accountability. "I understood exactly what you said," I replied, keeping my voice steady, and there was a brief pause on her end, just long enough to signal that this was not the response she expected. "Well, I did not mean it the way you are thinking," she continued, her tone tightening slightly. "You have always been sensitive," and there it was again, the shift from her words to my reaction, the responsibility quietly redirected. "Okay," I said, not agreeing, not arguing, just letting the words sit there, and that seemed to unsettle her more than anything else, because without resistance, there was nothing for her to push against, no angle to adjust, and after a second she changed direction. "Your father and I were talking this morning, and we think it would be good for you to come by later this week. We should spend more time together," she said, as if the invitation itself was proof that everything was fine, that connection could be scheduled and used to smooth over whatever had been said. "I have work," I answered, which was true, but also incomplete, because the real reason was that I was no longer willing to step back into that environment on their terms. Not without understanding what I was walking into, and she exhaled softly. "You are always busy," she said, not accusing, but not neutral either, just enough pressure to remind me of the role I was supposed to play, the one who adjusts, who makes space, who shows up. "I will let you know," I replied, and this time I ended the call before she could add anything else, not abruptly, just cleanly, without leaving room for the conversation to loop back into something familiar. I set my phone down and stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet of my apartment, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic outside, and I noticed something that would have felt impossible a few months earlier. I was not replaying the conversation in my head trying to find the right response. I was not questioning whether I had been too distant or too cold. I was simply observing it, the way you observe a pattern once you finally recognize it for what it is. Later that afternoon, I sat at my desk going through documents I had been meaning to organize for weeks, bank statements, emails, things that had nothing to do with them, but required focus, and as I worked, I kept noticing how much easier it felt to concentrate when I was not mentally preparing for the next interaction, not anticipating the next comment, not carrying that low-level tension that had been constant for years without me fully acknowledging it. My phone buzzed again, this time a text from Emily, short and direct. "Mom said you were upset, you need to relax." It was not that serious, and I stared at the message for a second, not because it hurt, but because it was so predictable, the same script delivered through a different voice, the same dismissal wrapped in casual language, and I typed a response, then deleted it, because explaining anything to her would only feed the cycle, give her something to respond to, something to reinterpret later. Instead, I set the phone face down and went back to my work, letting the silence do what it does best, reveal who is actually willing to sit with it and who needs to fill it immediately. By the time the sun started to set, casting that late afternoon light across the room, I realized something else had changed, something quieter but more significant than any conversation. I was no longer waiting for them to understand me, and without that expectation, every interaction felt different, lighter in some ways, more distant in others, but clearer overall, like I was finally seeing the structure of something that had always been there, just out of focus, and somewhere in the back of my mind, there was a detail I had not shared, not with them, not with anyone at that table, something that had been developing separately from all of this, something tied to decisions that had been made before that dinner ever happened, and I did not rush toward it, I did not use it yet, but I held on to it with a kind of quiet certainty, because for the first time I was not reacting to what they said, I was deciding what came next, and they had no idea how much that mattered. I did not go to their house that week, or the week after, and no one said it directly, but I could feel the shift in how they reached out, like something had gone slightly off script and they were trying to adjust without admitting it. My mom texted twice more, short messages, "We should talk," and then, "Your father wants to check in," both framed like concern but carrying that same underlying expectation that I would step back into place. And I did not ignore them completely, I just responded. Slower, more measured, without offering anything beyond what was necessary, because I was starting to understand that distance, when used correctly, does more than confrontation ever could. A few days later, I was at my desk when my phone rang again, this time my dad's name on the screen, which was rare enough that I answered without overthinking it, and his voice came through steady as always. "Hey, I was just thinking we have not seen you since Christmas," he said, like the gap itself was the issue, not what had caused it, and I let a second pass before responding. "I have been busy," and he gave a short laugh, the kind that tries to keep things light. "You are always busy, but family should come first." And there it was, the familiar line, the one that had always been used to pull me back in, to make my boundaries sound like neglect. "Family goes both ways," I said quietly, not sharp, just clear. And the silence on the other end stretched just long enough to register, because that was not a sentence I used before, not in that tone, not without softening it immediately after, and he cleared his throat slightly, shifting gears. "Your mother did not mean what she said," he added, "you know how she gets." And I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable, the same pattern again, her words reframed as a mood, something temporary, something that should not be taken seriously. And I realized they had always relied on that, the idea that nothing counted enough to require accountability. "I heard exactly what she said," I replied, and this time I did not add anything else. I did not explain how it felt, I did not justify why it mattered, I just let the statement stand on its own, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, until he said, more carefully now, "We just do not want this to turn into something bigger than it needs to be," and I leaned back in my chair, looking at the ceiling, because that sentence said more than he realized. It confirmed that they saw the problem as my reaction, not the original moment, and that clarity settled in quietly, without anger, without urgency. "It already is what it is," I answered, and that seemed to end the direction he had been going in, because after that, he moved into safer territory, asking about work, about my schedule, about things that did not require him to acknowledge anything uncomfortable. And I answered briefly, neutrally, keeping the conversation contained until it naturally ran out. And when we hung up, there was no tension left in me, no need to replay it, just a steady awareness that something fundamental had shifted and it was not going to move back. That afternoon, I checked my email and saw a message that had come in earlier that morning, the subject line simple, from a law office I recognized immediately, and I opened it slowly, not because I did not know what it was about, but because I wanted to read it without rushing, without attaching it to anything else. And as I went through the details, the language precise, formal, outlining what had already been set in motion weeks before that dinner, I felt that same quiet certainty return, the one that had been sitting in the background of everything, steady and unchanged. It was not new information, not entirely, but seeing it written out like that, structured, documented, made it real in a way that conversations never could. And I thought back to the timing, how this had all been finalized just days before that night, how none of them had known, how they had spoken so freely, so confidently, assuming the same balance of control they had always had, and I realized how much of their behavior depended on that assumption, on the belief that I needed them more than they needed me. My phone buzzed again, another message from Emily, "Mom is upset, you should call her," and I read it once, then set the phone down without responding, because the urgency in her message was not about me. It was about restoring the dynamic they were used to, the one where I responded quickly, explained myself, made things easier for them. Instead, I went back to the email, rereading a specific line, letting it settle fully. This time, not as a reaction, not as something to use immediately, but as a fact, something that existed whether they acknowledged it or not, and I closed my laptop slowly, the room quiet around me, the late afternoon light fading just enough to shift the tone of everything. And for the first time since that dinner, I understood exactly where this was going, not in a dramatic sense, not with some sudden plan, but in a clear, steady way that did not require urgency, because whatever happened next was not going to be decided at their table anymore, and they had no idea how close they were to realizing that. 2 days later, I drove across town to the law office, not because anything was urgent, but because I wanted to see it in person, to sit across from someone who dealt in facts instead of interpretations, and the building itself was exactly what you would expect: clean glass doors, neutral walls, the kind of place where everything feels intentional and nothing is left vague. When I stepped inside, the receptionist greeted me with a professional smile and asked for my name, and when I said it, there was a brief flicker of recognition before she nodded and said, "They are expecting you," which told me more than anything else could have. This had already been set in motion long before I walked in. I followed her down a quiet hallway into a conference room where a man in his late 50s stood up to shake my hand, introducing himself as Mr. Harlan, his voice calm, measured, the kind of tone that does not need to impress anyone because it already carries authority. And as we sat down, he opened a folder in front of him, neatly organized, every document placed with precision. "I wanted to go over everything with you directly," he said, sliding the first set of papers toward me, and I glanced down, recognizing the names, the structure, the language that had already been outlined in the email, but seeing it here, printed, formal, made it feel heavier, more final. "Your grandfather was very clear about his intentions," he continued, and I felt that sentence settle before I even read the rest, because clarity was not something my family ever dealt in. Everything there was always softened, reinterpreted, adjusted depending on who was speaking, but this was different, this was fixed. I ran my eyes over the details slowly, not rushing, taking in each section, each clause, and I could feel the timeline connecting in my mind: how this had been signed just days before that dinner, how none of them had known, how they had spoken to me with complete confidence in a version of reality that no longer existed. "There is also a stipulation," he added, tapping lightly on one page, and I looked up, meeting his eyes briefly before looking back down, reading more carefully now, and the wording was precise, leaving very little room for interpretation, outlining not just what had been left, but how it would be managed, who had access, and more importantly, who did not. "He trusted your judgment," Mr. Harlan said, his tone steady, "and he structured this so that decisions would be entirely in your control." And I nodded once, because there was nothing else to say to that. It was not emotional, it was not dramatic, it was simply a fact, one that shifted the entire balance of everything I had grown up with. I signed where I needed to sign, each movement deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant, and when it was done, he closed the folder with a quiet finality that felt more significant than any conversation I had had with my family in years. "If they reach out," he said carefully, choosing his words, "you are under no obligation to engage on anything you are not comfortable with." And I almost smiled at that, not because it was new information, but because hearing it from someone outside of that dynamic confirmed what I had already begun to understand, that obligation had always been assumed, not actual. When I stepped back outside, the air was colder than I expected, a sharp contrast to the controlled environment inside, and I stood there for a moment, letting it settle, not thinking about what I was going to do with any of it yet, just recognizing that everything had already changed whether anyone else realized it or not. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and when I checked it, there were 3 missed calls, all from my mom, and a text right underneath: "Call me as soon as you can, it is important." And I stared at it for a second longer than usual, not because I felt urgency, but because the tone had shifted. There was something different in the wording, less control, more need. Before I could decide whether to respond, another call came through, this time from my dad, and I let it ring once, twice, then answered, bringing the phone to my ear without saying anything immediately, letting him speak first. "We need to talk," he said, his voice tighter than before, less composed, and I leaned slightly against the side of my car, looking out at the parking lot as if the answer might be there. "About what?" I asked, even though I already had a sense of it, and there was a brief pause before he replied, "Something came up, and we think you might be involved," and that phrasing was careful, almost cautious, like he was testing the ground before stepping fully into it. "I am listening," I said, keeping my tone neutral, and he exhaled slowly. "Your grandfather's attorney reached out," he said, and there it was, the first crack, the moment where the information started to move beyond me and into their awareness, and for the first time since that dinner, I could hear something in his voice that had not been there before, uncertainty, and it settled quietly between us, because they were just beginning to understand that the version of me they had been talking to no longer existed in the way they thought it did, and I had not even said anything yet. There was a shift in his voice that I had never heard before, not anger, not authority, but something quieter and far less controlled, like he was trying to stay steady while stepping into something he did not fully understand yet, and I let the silence sit for a second before answering, not to create tension, but to give him space to fill it, because people reveal more when they feel the need to explain. What exactly did they say? I asked, my tone even, and he hesitated just long enough to confirm what I already suspected. They said there have been updates, he replied carefully, choosing each word like it mattered more than usual. Something about your grandfather's estate, and your name came up, and I leaned slightly forward, resting my hand against the side of the car, looking out across the empty lot as if the answer might appear there. Even though I already knew what he was circling around, my name is on a lot of things, I said calmly, not dismissive, just factual, and there was another pause, longer this time, because he was waiting for me to fill in the rest, to clarify, to make it easier for him, the way I always had before, and when I did not, he had to push further himself. We were not aware of any changes, he added, the word we carrying more weight than usual, like it was meant to include me, to pull me back into alignment with them, and I almost noticed the instinct to respond to that, too. Explained that I had not known everything either until recently, but I stopped myself, because that reflex belonged to a version of me that no longer needed to manage their understanding. There have been some updates, I said instead, keeping it simple, controlled, and I could feel the effect of that immediately, the way it shifted the balance of the conversation, because now he was the one trying to understand, not the other way around. We should sit down and go over everything together, he said, more directly now, like he was trying to re-establish structure. This affects all of us, and that sentence stayed with me for a second, not because it was wrong, but because of how quickly it had been reframed, from uncertainty to inclusion, from something new to something shared, and I realized how automatic that was for them, the assumption that anything connected to me ultimately belonged to the family as a whole. It affects me first, I replied, not sharply, just clearly, and there was a quiet shift on the other end of the line, like he had not expected that phrasing, not from me, not in that tone, and he exhaled slowly, adjusting again. Of course, he said, but it did not sound like agreement, it sounded like recalculation. Your mother is very concerned, he added, and I almost asked concerned about what, but I already knew the answer was not about me, it was about control, about understanding where things stood and how much influence they still had. And before I could respond, another voice came through faintly in the background, my mom, asking something I could not fully hear, but the urgency in it was clear even through the distance. She wants to talk to you, he said, his voice slightly lower now, like he was bridging the space between us and her, and I straightened a little, not out of tension, but out of awareness, because this was the moment where everything would normally fold back into the familiar pattern, where I would soften, explain, reassure. But I did not move in that direction. I am not available right now, I said, keeping my tone neutral, and there was a brief silence, sharper this time, because that was not the response they were used to, not the timing they expected, and I could almost picture the look on her face, the way she would process that, not as a boundary, but as resistance. This is important, he pressed, and I let that word sit for a second before answering. Because it mattered which version of important he meant, theirs or mine. I understand that, I said, and I will reach out when I am ready, and that was the first time I had ever said something like that to him without immediately softening it, without adding anything to make it easier to accept, and I could feel the weight of it settle on both sides of the line. We just want to make sure everything is handled properly, he said finally, his voice more measured again, but the uncertainty had not disappeared, it had only been covered, and I nodded slightly, even though he could not see it. It will be, I replied. And I meant it, not as reassurance for him, but as a statement of fact. When the call ended, I stayed there for a moment, the phone still in my hand, the cold air sharper now against my skin, and I realized how different this felt from every other interaction we had ever had, not because of what was being said, but because of what I was no longer doing. I was not managing their reactions, not anticipating their expectations, not stepping into the space they had always created for me. My phone buzzed again almost immediately, my mom this time, her name flashing across the screen. And I watched it ring without answering, not out of anger, not as a statement, but because I had already said what needed to be said, and for the first time, I understood that silence was not avoidance, it was control, and they were just beginning to feel what that meant. By the end of that week, The call stopped sounding like routine check-ins and started carrying a different kind of urgency, not loud, not dramatic, but sharper, more frequent, like something underneath had shifted and they could feel it slipping. I did not rush to answer any of them, not because I was avoiding the conversation, but because I was letting it unfold without interfering, and that gave me something I had never had before, a clear view of how quickly their tone changed when they no longer controlled the pace. It was Friday afternoon when I finally agreed to meet them, not at their house, not in that space where everything had always been defined on their terms, but at a small restaurant halfway between us, neutral ground, quiet enough to talk without distractions, and when I walked in, they were already there, sitting across from each other, my mom's posture stiff, her hands folded too neatly on the table, my dad looking down at the menu without really reading it, and the moment they saw me, both of them stood up at the same time, which they had never done before. "Thank you for coming," my mom said quickly, her voice softer than usual, careful in a way that immediately stood out, and I nodded once, taking my seat without responding to the tone shift, because I wanted to hear what they would say without being guided by anything else. For a moment, nobody spoke, the kind of silence that usually made me uncomfortable in the past, but now just felt like space, and my dad was the first to break it, clearing his throat slightly. "We spoke with the attorney," he said, his voice controlled but no longer steady in the same way it used to be, "and we need to understand exactly what is going on." And I looked at him for a second before answering, not rushing, not filling the gap too quickly. "What part do you not understand?" I asked, and that question seemed to catch them off guard, because it shifted the responsibility back onto them to define the issue instead of expecting me to explain everything. My mom leaned forward slightly, her expression tightening just enough to show that this was not going the way she expected. "Do not do that," she said, her voice still soft but carrying a familiar edge underneath. "This affects the entire family, and you know that." And I held her gaze, steady, not challenging, just present. "It affects me first," I repeated, and this time the words landed differently, because now they had context, now they knew there was something real behind them. My dad exhaled slowly, his hand resting flat against the table. "We are not trying to take anything from you," he said, choosing his words carefully. "We just need clarity," and I nodded once, because that was closer to the truth than anything else they had said so far. "You have clarity," I replied. "You were contacted, you were informed, and the structure was explained." And I could see the shift in my mom's expression, the moment where information stopped being abstract and started feeling like limitation. "That is not the same as understanding what you are planning to do," she said, and there it was, the real question, not what exists, but what control they still had over it, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting that sit for a second before answering. "I am not planning anything right now," I said. And that was true, but incomplete, because what I was doing was deciding. And that process did not need to be shared. My mom's fingers tightened slightly against each other, a small movement, but enough to show the tension she was trying to keep contained. "We have responsibilities," she continued, her tone shifting again, moving towards something more familiar, something that sounded like expectation. "There are financial commitments, obligations that were always understood," and I watched her carefully as she spoke, noticing how naturally the language of assumption came back when she felt pressure. "Understood by who?" I asked, not sharply, just directly, and that question seemed to interrupt the flow of what she had been building, because it required her to say something specific instead of relying on implication. "By this family," she said after a second, and I nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the pattern. "That is not how this is structured," I replied, and I kept my tone even, calm, the same way I had been speaking the entire time, because there was no need to raise it, no need to push harder when the reality itself was already doing that. My dad leaned forward slightly now, his voice lower, more serious. "Are you saying we have no access?" he asked, and that question carried everything underneath it, concern, confusion, and something else that had not been there before, a kind of quiet realization, and I held his gaze for a moment before answering, not quickly, not defensively, just clearly. "I am saying that nothing moves without my decision," and the silence that followed was immediate and heavy, because that was the first time I had said it out loud, not implied, not softened, but stated as a fact, and I could see it land in both of them at the same time, the moment where everything they had assumed began to shift into something they were not prepared for. and I did not add anything else. I did not explain it further, because I did not need to. The meaning was already there. And for the first time since that dinner, I watched them process me not as the version they had always known, but as someone they could no longer define the same way, and neither of them knew what to say next. The silence after I said it did not break the way it used to. There was no quick correction, no immediate shift back into control, just a pause that felt heavier than anything that had been said so far, and I watched it settle across the table, the way my mom's expression tightened just slightly, the way my dad leaned back a fraction like he needed space to process something he had not prepared for. That is not how this was supposed to work, my mom said finally, her voice lower now, less controlled than before, and I did not interrupt. I let her continue, because this was the part where the real reaction started to show, not the polished version, not the one meant for appearances, but the one underneath. Your grandfather would not have intended for you to handle something like this alone, she added, and there it was again, the attempt to reshape the situation into something that fit her understanding, to imply that control should still exist somewhere within her reach, and I met her gaze without changing my expression. He was very clear, I said, and I kept it simple, because the more direct the truth is, the harder it is to argue with. My dad rubbed his hand across his jaw, a small gesture, but one that told me he was recalculating, trying to find a way to stabilize what was slipping. We have always managed things as a unit, he said, his tone more measured, almost careful. Decisions like this affect long-term planning, stability, everything we have built, and I listened without reacting, because I recognized the shift. This was no longer about understanding, it was about influence, about re-establishing a framework where my decision would still pass through them. What you built was based on assumptions, I replied, not harsh, just precise, and that landed harder than anything else I had said, because it did not argue, it did not accuse, it simply removed the foundation they were standing on. My mom leaned forward again, her voice tightening now, the softness gone. You are making this into something it does not need to be, she said, this is still your family, and for a second, I almost responded the way I used to, with something that softened the edge, something that reassured, but I stopped, because I understood now that reassurance was what allowed everything to continue unchanged. I know exactly what this is, I said instead, and I held her gaze long enough for that to settle, and the silence that followed was different this time, not uncertain, not searching, but tense, because now they were reacting to something they could not redirect. My dad shifted forward slightly, his voice lower, more direct. Then help us understand what you are going to do, he said, and I noticed the word help, the way it carried expectation without sounding like a demand, and I shook my head slightly, not in refusal, but in correction. You do not need to understand my decisions, I replied, you need to understand the structure, and that distinction changed everything, because it removed them from the center of it. It made it clear that this was not a negotiation, not something that required their agreement. My mom's composure broke just enough for it to show, her voice sharper now. You cannot just shut us out, she said, and I let that sit for a second before answering, because that sentence revealed more than she intended. It was not about inclusion, it was about access, about control, about the expectation that nothing important would move without them. I am not shutting anyone out, I said calmly, I am setting the boundary that was already written. And I could see the moment that landed, the shift from argument to realization, the understanding that this was not something I had created in reaction to them. It was something that existed independently of their influence. My dad looked at me for a long second, really looked. This time, not at the version of me he was used to, but at what was in front of him now, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, not louder, not softer, just different. This is going to affect more than you think, he said, and I nodded once. Because that was the first completely honest thing he had said since we sat down. I know, I replied, and I meant it, not as acknowledgement of their concern, but as acceptance of reality. My mom leaned back slightly, her hands no longer folded neatly, her control slipping just enough to be visible. We have supported you, she said, her tone shifting again, reaching for something that sounded like leverage. We have always been there, and I looked at her, not reacting to the words, but to the timing of them, because they only appeared when something was at risk, never before, never without a reason. That is not what this is about, I said, and I kept my voice steady, because there was no need to escalate. The truth was already doing the work, and for a moment, nobody spoke, the tension sitting fully between us now, not hidden, not softened, just present. A server passed by, asking if we needed anything else, and my dad shook his head without looking away from me, and when the moment passed, the silence returned, heavier now, more final, because something had shifted that could not be undone, and I could see it in both of them, the realization settling in, not all at once, but enough to change how they were looking at me, not as someone they could guide back into place, but as someone they could no longer move the same way, and I did not rush to fill that silence. I let it stay exactly where it was, because for the first time, it was not something I needed to fix. The silence at that table did not break the way it used to, it did not soften or dissolve into something easier, it stayed there, heavy and undeniable, and for the first time in my life, I did not feel responsible for fixing it. My mom looked at me like she was trying to recognize something that no longer fit into the version she had built, her expression caught somewhere between frustration and disbelief, and my dad sat back slowly, his hands resting on the table, no longer directing the conversation, no longer guiding it forward, just sitting with something he could not reshape. So that is it? My mom asked finally, her voice quieter now, not sharp, not controlled, just uncertain in a way I had never heard from her before, and I held her gaze for a second before answering, not rushing, not filling the space too quickly. That is where things stand, I said, and I meant every word of it, not as a reaction, not as a statement meant to hurt, but as a line that had already been drawn long before we sat down. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just slightly, and for a moment she looked older, not physically, but in the way someone does when they realize something is no longer within reach. We are still your family, she said, softer now, and I nodded once, because that was true, but it was not the part that mattered anymore. I know, I replied, and I did not add anything else, because I did not need to explain what that meant now. My dad leaned forward again, his voice steady but different, stripped of the certainty it always carried. We need time to figure this out, he said, and I could hear the shift in that sentence, not a demand, not a direction, but a recognition that things were no longer moving through him, and I nodded once more. Take whatever time you need, I said, because I was not the one rushing anymore. The server returned briefly, placing the check on the table without interrupting the tension that had settled around us, and my dad reached for it automatically, then hesitated, his hand pausing just long enough to notice the movement, before setting it back down, and that small moment said more than anything else had, because it showed the instinct to act, followed by the awareness that things were no longer automatic. I reached for the check instead, not as a gesture, not to prove anything, just because it was there, and I placed my card on top of it without looking up, keeping everything as simple as possible, and neither of them stopped me, neither of them commented, because they were still adjusting to what they were seeing. When I stood up, the chair sliding back quietly against the floor, my mom looked up at me again, something softer in her expression now, something that might have been regret, or might have just been uncertainty. We should talk again soon, she said, and I met her eyes for a second before answering, we will, and that was all I gave her. No timeline, no reassurance, just the possibility, and even that felt different now. I walked out of the restaurant without rushing, the door closing quietly behind me, and the cold air outside hit harder this time, sharper, clearer, like everything else had become, and I stood there for a moment, breathing it in, letting the quiet settle around me, not as something empty, but as something steady. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I did not check it right away, because for once, there was nothing I needed to respond to immediately, nothing waiting for me to explain or fix or adjust, and when I finally took it out, there were no new messages, just the last one sitting there, unchanged, and I slipped it back into my pocket without opening them. As I walked toward my car, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement, I thought about how long I had spent trying to earn something that was never actually being offered, how many times I had adjusted myself to fit a version of family that only worked if I stayed in a certain place, and for the first time, I did not feel the need to revisit any of it, not to justify it, not to understand it, just to leave it where it belonged. I got into the driver's seat and closed the door, the quiet inside the car wrapping around me, and I rested my hands on the steering wheel for a second before starting the engine, not because I needed the pause, but because I recognized what it meant. This moment was not about what they had said, or what they would say next, it was about what I had finally stopped doing. I was no longer waiting to be seen the way I had always hoped, I was no longer measuring my worth against their version of it, and that shift did not feel loud or dramatic, it felt quiet, controlled, permanent. I pulled out of the parking lot slowly, the road ahead empty, the city lights stretching out in front of me, and for the first time I did not look back, not at the restaurant, not at the table we had just left, not at anything that belonged to the version of me that had stayed there too long, because I already knew something they were only just beginning to understand. They could call me whatever they wanted, they could rewrite me in any way that made sense to them, but none of it changed the only thing that mattered anymore. I was the one deciding what came next, and this time I was not giving that away.